It's a real honor for me to introduce our special guest and keynote speaker tonight. Of course, you all know that Michael Dombeck recently culminated a 22-year career in public land and wildlife management as Chief of the United States Forest Service. But there's a lot more to that. And talking to him before this, he wanted me to express that the proudest and most outstanding part of his career was some years ago, where he spent 11 years as a fishing guide in northern Wisconsin, where he grew up in a small town of about 1,500 people. And that's where I think you'll see his career being influenced very strongly from there, because he has a real strong and long history as a fisheries biologist, having received a PhD in fisheries biology from Iowa State University. But I do have to say, as a native of Iowa, that Iowa State may be the Cyclones, but Iowa is the Hawkeye State. Sorry. But obviously, he's no dummy, even if he did go to Iowa State. They don't give away PhDs over there, I know that for a fact. So, but he has and continues to have a real long association with fisheries management, public lands management, and in fact had risen up through the ranks to become a regional fisheries program manager for the Forest Service, and then the national fisheries program manager for the entire Forest Service in the late 80s. During the 90s, among the posts he held were acting director of the Bureau of Land Management, another large federal agency. And of course, as Chief of the Forest Service, he didn't have very much responsibility. 33,000 employees, 192 million acres of national forests, and a $4.4 billion annual budget. So maybe he can give us some tips on how the Alliance can increase its budget. But I think that among the advancements really that are near and dear to our hearts, and one of the reasons we're happy to have him here as a special guest and to share some of his wisdom with us, is the profound impact that he had on the Forest Service and federal land management. He's, as an individual, written and co-authored several scientific papers on fisheries management, aquatic watershed management, ecosystem management, and public lands. And more importantly, to my mind, and I think many of us as Chief of the Forest Service, took monumental steps to shift management of national forests to an ecological basis, which gives lots of opportunity for further improvements in the future, which I think most of us here would agree there is still plenty of room for improvement, but it laid the groundwork and foundation of where we can advance and make those things possible. And some of the things that he did also while at the Forest Service was revamp the accounting system. And under his leadership, for the first time in history, the Forest Service admitted it was losing money on timber sales, and we had better accountability, and he did quite a bit of work with the Congress and other branches of government to reestablish credibility at the Forest Service. So these are some big things that have been done that have really, we've noticed the difference over the years. Of course, the roadless policy, which emanated during his tenure, and which we still have an opportunity to continue to shape and protect. So we're real proud to have him here, and please give a great reception to Mr. Michael Dombeck.
Well, thank you, Mike. With that introduction, I think I would be better off just not saying anything and going and sitting down. But it is always good for me to come back to Montana, and as I think about the wonderful opportunities I've had my entire life, western Montana, northern Idaho have always been one of my very, very favorite places in the world, along with the lake country of Ontario and northern Wisconsin, where I grew up. In fact, Mike said, well, send me your resume. What should I say about you? And I said, well, the only thing I really care that you say about me is that I spent 11 years as a fishing guide. Because I think really we think about how is it that we connect with nature. And I'll talk about that in a little while, but that was really, a tremendous opportunity for me to be out in nature in the beautiful lakes and rivers of the Chequamegon and Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. So then you say, well, how the heck does a guy like that end up in Washington, D.C.? And I wondered that myself. But there was one saving grace, and that's that the chief's office in Washington, D.C. is within sight of the body of water that produced the U.S. record carp. And that's the Tidal Basin. And that is not a fish story. That was a 57-pounder caught in 1983. I haven't perfected my carp fishing yet, but I think it's a good thing to do. I'm going to try to perfect a little bit of trout fishing on Saturday. So I'm really looking forward to that. I applaud you for the theme of this rendezvous, making connections and protecting the core, because as a federal employee and for a long time, and there's a lot of friends and colleagues of mine here in the audience. I see Bill out there, and Roger took care of me for a while, and Julia Reiber did lots of work, and others that are here that I may not have talked to. I just thank you for that. It's a tremendous workforce that we have. And I always talked about the importance of going back to basics. Sometimes I think life is maybe a little bit too complicated, or we try to make it too complicated. And I think September 11 was a reminder of that for all of us. In fact, September 11th, I believe, was the first time ever, it was for me, I know, and probably for most of you, a first time ever experience. It was the first time that we were really threatened on our turf the way we were, and deep emotions and deep feelings emanate from that. And my hope is that we as Americans rally around this unifying point, that it isn't a flash like Desert Storm was, and that we rally to protect the core of what's important to Americans, the core of what's important to all of us, to protect our freedoms. The freedom to move about, the freedom to do what we want to do, the freedom not to have to worry about our safety, the safety of our families and friends. We need to rally around that point to protect the core of our public lands, the conservation agenda. We need to rally around that point because the quality of life depends upon that. Because you and I, as citizens of the United States, together own hundreds of millions of acres of land. This is our birthright. Our forefathers died securing the freedoms that we have, some of the freedoms that were threatened on September 11. And these 500 or so million of acres of public land is really, it's a concept that's in a sense uniquely American. Other cultures have their pyramids, their works of art. England and Spain has its great sea captains. Rome and Athens has its temples. The Far East has its dynasties. We have our public lands. We have our wild lands, our frontier. And this frontier really shaped the character of Americans. And our heroes are the likes of Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, Chief Joseph, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone. These are the people that we admire, and their skills, they endured the frontier. It shaped their character, and it's part of what we are as a nation. And our challenge in the future is to continue to protect this core. There was a time that the landscape in the West, the public lands, were viewed as an inexhaustible resource, a resource that individuals could personally profit from, and nobody seemed to care. But that all changed about 100 years ago, and we do now care. We paid a high price. We saw the environmental disasters. We saw the cut and run era in the area that I grew up in, northern Wisconsin, with the tremendous pine forests, the hemlock forests that no longer exist today. We saw the tragedy of the commons in the West and the grazing issues that occurred here in the 1800s. We've learned from that. We saw the degradation. Well, September 11 of this year is a day that a lot of people will remember. But September is an important month for another reason, because another very tragic event occurred that changed the course of history, particularly the course of conservation history. And that event occurred 100 years ago on September 6, 1901. When a shot was fired. A shot was fired by a disturbed anarchist named Leon Chagall. That seriously wounded President McKinley while he was attending the Pan Am Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Theodore Roosevelt at the time was speaking to members of the Vermont Fish and Game League at a luncheon on Lake Champlain. On hearing the news, Roosevelt and his aides rushed to be at the president's side in Buffalo to monitor his condition. By the 10th of September, President McKinley had begun to improve. So the vice president thought, well, this would be a good time to take a few days off. So he met his family at Camp Tahawas, which is one of the very remote areas in the state of New York, at the base of Mount Marcy, which is the highest peak in the state of New York. They spent the night in a cabin. TR, his wife Edith, two of his sons, hiked about halfway up the mountain, spent the second night. Edith and the kids went back down the mountain. TR and his team ascended to the peak, got there about 11 in the morning, started back down, had lunch at Lake Tier of the Clouds, which is the highest point of the source of the Hudson River. While they were having lunch, a guide came out of the woods with a yellow telegram. And the telegram brought news that the president's condition had worsened, and the vice president was to immediately come to Buffalo. So they hiked down the mountain, boarded a night train to Buffalo. TR and his aides got there in the morning to hear the news that McKinley had died. That night, Teddy Roosevelt took the oath of office and became the 26th President of the United States. Roosevelt's rise shocked many of the political leaders of the time and many of the leaders of his own Republican Party. He had joined the vice presidential ticket reluctantly, only after being pushed into that post by party leaders who wanted him out of New York. They felt that to put him in the dusty attic of the vice presidency was a good place to put this guy that had this leaning toward conservation legislation. The political cognoscente in New York wanted this bull moose out of their china shop that was threatening their profits. And now, as the leader of the Republican Party said, that damn cowboy is president. And in fact, that series of events changed the course of conservation history. So when we look at September 11, it's really very difficult for us to predict what kind of impact that will have. Now, if we look back in my last several years in agency leadership jobs, I started to spend more and more time reading the history and really realizing how valuable that was to look back and to see what happened and try to then use that to sort of look ahead of the headlights. But it was interesting in Teddy Roosevelt's day, because it wasn't since Thomas Jefferson that we had a president, a chief executive, that was so well informed in natural sciences. In fact, if we look at some of his diaries, and if you haven't read Edmund Morris's The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, I recommend it. It's a good read and very, very instructive. But if we look at some of the diaries where on a typical day on the campaign trail, Teddy Roosevelt might give 7 speeches, dictate letters, meet with the press, but he would reserve from 12 to 12:30 to do things like ornithological readings. Can you imagine a politician at that level being so well informed? I think we long for the day for that kind of informed leadership on issues. And now that damn cowboy, that hyperactive intellectual, was in the White House. And in fact, his tenure from 1901 to 1909 was tumultuous, it was invigorating, it was dramatic, it was provocative, and it was challenging, and it defined what conservation is and remains today. To be conservative with the land, the very root of the word implies, which in many cases today it seems as though it's almost the opposite of what the conservative elements of certain parties focus on when it comes to conservation and the environment. Well, Roosevelt's legacy is 250 million acres or more of national forests, national parks, national monuments, national wildlife refuges. And in fact, he defined what we see as conservation, and he did protect the core. He made the connection, and he delivered on the land. Well, where are we today in making those connections, in protecting the core? Where are we in the transition of what Teddy Roosevelt did 100 years ago in his presidency that began 100 years ago this month? The Wilderness Act passed in 1964 with a vote of 99-1 in the Senate. How would that vote turn out today? And why? Most of the progressive conservation environmental legislation was signed by Republican presidents. And yet today, it seems as though conservatives are more often defined as anti-environment, anti-conservation. Why the rural-urban divide? Bush won most of rural America, about 2,400 of the nation's 3,100 counties. And Gore won 3-1 in the urban areas. Why that divide? And what can we do about it? Why the perception that it's economy versus the environment? What can we do to bring these two necessities together in the quality of life to protect that core that we have? Well, lots of good things are going on, and one of my frustrations as chief of the Forest Service was always there are so many good things going on that these 33,000 employees are involved in, and yet what was on my lap, on my desk, were difficult challenges like dealing with roadless, dealing with financial issues. I believe I was the only chief ever in history to have one hearing in front of 3 committee chairs at the same time on issues of accountability and financial management. Let me tell you, that'll get your attention. But there are many, many good things going on, and in a sense I feel politically that from the era of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, power was sort of gathering in Washington. We had a lot of legislation passed. We were shaping it and determining how to implement it. People like Bill Wharf was in it up to his neck when it came to wilderness, and many other issues. And now, starting about 1990, maybe the late 80s, the power is now emanating away from Washington, because if you ask yourself, in the era of the 90s, for example, what significant legislation was passed by Congress influencing conservation or the environment? In fact, many of the issues that agencies deal with and struggle with are a result of the inability of Congress to act. I mean, if Montana and Idaho would get on with their wilderness legislation and their wilderness package, we probably wouldn't have this roadless debate on the table. The agency is sort of stuck because other entities can't move or won't move or can't build a majority. And we continually see the balance of power shifting, and that makes some folks somewhat uncomfortable. But the fact is, the important thing is that we do lead on those kind of issues to make sure that we make the connection and protect the core. I want to switch gears now, and I just could not resist, particularly with the terrible events that happened on September 11, really reflecting back on history and how some tragedies really take us down paths that we don't realize. But what I'd like to talk about now is just spend a few minutes talking about what I believe are the Big Ten. The Big Ten conservation challenges in front of us here in the United States, but these transcend globally because we're not in an isolationist world. We can't hide from exotic species, some of these issues. And these 10 issues are no more than based upon my biases, my nearly quarter of a century in the trenches dealing with various issues. And I mentioned the 1872 mining law first. And I mention it first because it's perhaps the most vexing and outdated of all the U.S. natural resource laws. In fact, it's interesting to note that the 1872 mining law was passed before women could vote and before most minorities could vote. The country was struggling with Civil War reconstruction. St. Louis represented the frontier to most people. It was a law written by miners, for miners, because the country was busy doing something else, recovering from the Civil War. Another lesson of the kinds of things that can happen when the energy of the country is distracted on other issues. And the most phenomenal thing is the 1872 mining law has stood the test of time and was almost changed in the early 90s. Had Congress been in session perhaps another week or two, we were very close. Congress adjourned, and no change in 1872 mining law. Not only has it got antiquated royalty provisions, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but it still allows privatization of public lands for $2.50 to $5 an acre. Every other use, grazing, oil and gas, recreation, timber, is subject to approval or rejection by a field manager for environmental or safety reasons, all but hard rock mining. Stuart Udall left office in the late 60s saying that the 1872 mining law changing the 1872 mining law was one of the major needs that we have. And let's hope now that the current distractions that we have don't tempt those to open up the Rocky Mountain front. I want to talk a little bit about wildland fire, just to reflect back on some history as what I think is another one of the 10 challenges that we have. There's a lot to be learned from the Smokey Bear campaign. The Smokey Bear campaign was perhaps the most successful public information, public education campaign in the history of this country, maybe even the history of the world. Do you know that in 1968 more people knew who Smokey was than knew who the president was? In 1968, Smokey was the second most popular character, the second most recognized character in the United States. Do you know who the first one was? Santa Claus. Mickey Mouse was number 3. A tremendous public education campaign that really started, the real turning point in fire suppression occurred in 1910, which was a horrific year, sort of like last year was. And that's when we as a nation declared all-out war on every fire, everywhere, every time. By 1935, the Forest Service formally adopted a policy that all smokes were out by 10 a.m. They didn't matter where they were. And finally, in the 1960s, the 1970s, we began to appreciate the fact that fire was part of the ecosystem, that fire was a cleansing agent, just like wind and just like water. And we need to put fire back on the landscape. And the fact is that the forests evolved with fire. The forests are adapted to fire. It's our habitation that's not. And the particularly striking thing that I learned, and I spent, it seemed like a good share of my summer in either Idaho or Montana last year, is it really drove the point home that the single most important thing that you can do to protect your house is within 200 to 500 feet of that structure. The very most important thing, and if you don't have your property or buildings fireproofed, go back and do it. It's not very hard to do. That's so important. The urban wildland interface causes all of the firefighting community tremendous challenges, and the fact is that we've got the best wildland firefighters in the world, and a lot of them are trained right here in Missoula. The elite of the world firefighting workforce is trained, and many of them live right here. The fact is that now we have homes and subdivisions and houses all over the urban wildland interface. You know, and it's not just the Rocky Mountain front, it's not just Lake Tahoe, it's not just the Cascades, it's not just the West Slope. It's basically all over the country. And for every structure that has to be protected in a wildland fire, the costs escalate tremendously. And it's a significant challenge. Not to mention the smoke and the air quality challenges, the challenges of the acceptance of prescribed fire in the right place at the right time, and yet you've got something that's very dangerous all the time, has to be respected. And the fact is that fire issues are interwoven with timber management policies, and in certain areas with grazing management policies. And the fact is many of the most severe fires that occurred were slash fires after careless timber harvest. The Peshtigo fire in my home state, which remains the most devastating wildland fire in history, occurred in 1871. It was burning the same time as the Chicago fire, with 1,500 people losing their lives. It was a slash fire in a very dry year. And if anything, the whole fire issue should really be a reminder that this man over nature business really doesn't work very well. We don't manage ecosystems, we work within them. We may influence, we may tweak them somewhat, but the fact is the powers of Mother Nature are out there and they're very strong, and fire teaches us that very important lesson. And another issue I want to mention associated with fire is we come out of perhaps a culture and a budget structure that timber harvest paid the bills in much of the management. And in fact, the reason that some of the dog hair stands that develop after the old growth harvest with total fire suppression is really because the dollars aren't there, and the timber lobby and others lose interest in those tracts of land, and suddenly we have a conflagration like we had last year. And the fact is we need to make the right kind of investments in the land. And I hope we learn that as a society. My issue number 3 is water. And these are not in any sequence, and I believe of all the issues in this century, or perhaps this millennium, water is going to be the biggie. Now, if you take a look at the California energy crisis that we experienced earlier this year, and you replace the word energy with water, now you got a problem. We evolved as a species, without electricity. We can probably do okay, although it wouldn't be very convenient, and I'm certainly not advocating it. Now you try it without water, and you have a problem. And it's this tremendously valuable resource that we don't pay nearly as much attention to as a society as we should. And yet if we look at the history books, this planet is littered with civilizations that disappeared as a result of poor land management practices and contamination or depletion of their water supplies. We look at the issues of desertification, the importance of keeping the vegetation on the land to maintain the cycles. It's so important. And yet we're the water planet. I mean, what did we see from outer space? This nice white and blue ball. Even the colors emanate from the water. But the fact is 97.5% of the water on planet Earth is salt water. We can't drink it. Most crops won't grow. Another 1.73% is locked up in glaciers in the Arctic and Antarctic as ice. And what we have of this water planet is 8/10,000ths of 1% that's usable, renewable water accessible to life on planet Earth. What are the key limiting factors as we look at challenges that face cities like Las Vegas, Scottsdale, Arizona, San Diego? Water. And the water issues are just not limited to the arid West, to desert areas. You go to Florida, you've got ocean water encroaching the freshwater prism because we're extracting it faster than it can replenish itself. Look at the Ogallala Aquifer that goes from South Dakota to Texas. We're extracting water at a rate 40 times faster than it's being replenished. And now in some areas, the Ogallala Aquifer is from 10 to 100 feet below historic levels. One generation, one day, is going to deal with this issue. The wars over water, the controversies over water. In Desert Storm, the Washington Post had a quote in 1991 that from an individual in the Mideast that says, if you think you have wars over oil, wait till you see the wars over water. And one of our challenges is to maintain watershed function, to restore watershed function wherever we can. And the fact is our forested landscapes, the 1/3 of the United States that forested produces 2/3 of the runoff. And it's, in a sense, to me, I view it's a travesty that we as a society, with our $1.29 a pint bottles of water, we're acclimating a society not to expect good clean water to come out of a tap. Think of the ramifications of a generation or 2 generations that won't demand fresh water out of a tap. Are we always going to be able to afford to pay $1.29 a pint? I mean, this stuff is more expensive than gasoline. Who would have dreamt of that 30 years ago? The National Forest, 192 million acres, we did an analysis. I had a team put together to take a look at the water values on National Forest. We talk a lot about board feet of timber and what they're worth. We talk about ounces of gold. We talk about tons of coal. Well, what about this water resource that we have? And in fact, the 192 million acres of National Forest provide drinking water for 60 million Americans in 33 states and about 3,400 communities. And the marginal value, the very minimal value of water running off a national forest is about $3.7 billion a year. And if we put economic values on water like we do other commodities, it would just blow everything sky high. There would be no comparison. And the fact is that the performance of every single land manager, state, county, federal, local, ought to be water quality, would probably be the fairest measure. Because within water quality, we see a reflection of the quality of the land management. Urban, rural, forest, agricultural is all reflected in water and what we do. The water, in a sense, is the circulatory system of what we do. I mentioned exotic species earlier. It's another issue that I believe is going to be a tremendously difficult issue for us to deal with. And the more we can be proactive versus reactive. I just think of the ramifications of exotic species so far. White pine blister rust, chestnut blight, changed the silvicultural makeup of the eastern hardwood forests. Kudzu, melaleuca in the Everglades, tar thistle, sea lamprey, zebra mussel, white top, leafy spurge, Asian longhorn beetle. The list goes on and on and on. And the reality is we're really transporting millions of bacteria, viruses, spores, seeds, the germ plasm of lots of organisms around the world on a daily basis. And one of the interesting exercises that we were involved in a couple of years ago was to take a look at, what are the sort of some of the big social issues or the big demographic issues that are going to face us in this century that we may not be thinking about. And part of that exercise was to look at some of the things that people 100 years ago were concerned about. And there was actually a conference held around 1900 that talked about some predictions. And they got a lot of things right. The speed of computation, they didn't guess the internet. Talked about population growth, talked about increased nutrition, medical care. One thing they missed that has changed the face of how we interact with the world as a species is the rate of travel. And at that time, they predicted that lightning speed for the human species around the globe might be 50 miles an hour. And here we are circling the globe at faster than the speed of sound. And if you go out in outer space, it can be a lot faster than that. We've recreated Pangea, in a sense, with our transportation systems. And we've really, in a sense, thrust the world into evolutionary high gear as species compete with one another and are thrust into vacant niches. And the interesting thing is, you know what our best defense against exotic species is? It's protecting the core. Our wilderness areas, our roadless areas, our undisturbed areas, these are the bulwarks, the areas that are most resistant to infestation of exotic species. And obviously we need to be vigilant with our inspections, with our standards. We need to make sure that our research is directed in a proactive manner so we understand the life histories of species before they're on our shores, and then we have to deal with them. I want to talk a little bit about land fragmentation. And these issues are really all intertwined, but it's another challenge that we have in this prosperous society, in this prosperous country that we have today. If we think about the fact that the city of Atlanta has sprawled over 400,000 acres of rich forest land in the southeast. The number of tracts of forest land, 50 acres or less, from 1998 to 1994 doubled. The rate of development in the 1990s was double the rate of development of farmland, wetland, forest land, was double the earlier decade. As Will Rogers said, buy land, they ain't making it anymore. And as we diminish our tract size, we lose a lot of our flexibilities, and that's so important. We're loving our parks to death. Our 104 million acre congressionally designated wilderness preservation system does not have a complete representation of all the ecosystems yet. It's a lot of rock and ice and areas that were inaccessible. We need to think of our bottomland hardwoods. We need to think about our tallgrass prairies and other ecosystems. In fact, on the way out here, and Julia, you might mention this, I was reading a Round River that Rick Swanson gave me in 1994. I'm finally getting to it. And I was reading what Aldo Leopold was writing about during World War II to kind of get a feel for the time that we're in. And one of the things that he talked about back then in one of the wilderness articles, in fact, Bill, you probably know which one it is. It's only about a page and a half long, but he talked about the most valuable use of wilderness to society is this is our library of what it was like. And at that time, what he was doing, one of the things he was doing is trying to fight the harvest of the Porcupine Mountains in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that was basically a virgin maple forest. And with the war effort and the demand for timber, yet that was threatened, and yet because of his influence and some other things, they managed to protect at least part of the Porcupine Mountains in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. If you haven't been there, I recommend it. It's a nice place to be. One of my favorite quotes of Leopold's is that he said 50 years from now, the acquisition of public game lands may be recognized as a milestone in the evolution of democratic government. And I think as we look at what we have today, that has proven to be true. And I think about the era of the devolution of public land management in 1994. In fact, I was sitting on the stage with Jack Ward Thomas in Chattanooga, Tennessee at the Outdoor Writers Conference when Jack extemporaneously basically said, is he for devolution of public land? Is not only no, but hell no. This resource that we have, and those that were proponents of devolution of public land quickly backpedaled, and it wasn't the extreme enviro groups, as some would put it, that were opposing it. It was the Billings Rod and Gun Club and people that were concerned about access to public land. Places where I grew up, it's almost impossible now to trade out of public land, no matter how small the piece is, because somebody that lives there hunts on it or fishes on it or hikes on it, and they want to have continued access to that tract of land. I want to, I've only got a few more. Old growth forests and grasslands, but primarily old growth forest. This issue probably symbolizes the forest management debate more than anything else. The spotted owl issue was really about old growth and a nation coming to grips with how much old growth do we want to have left? How much do we keep? My home state of Wisconsin, the state tree, Michigan, the white pine, old growth white pine forest ecosystems don't exist. Are we ever going to have it? And yet this is virtually the tree that built America that people revere. Where are we going to have it? When? How soon are we going to start working on it? So important. Another issue, and I'll cover some of these a little more quickly, the loss of biodiversity. And I want to commend the Wild Rockies Alliance for having species like the grizzly and the bull trout as year hallmark species. But the fact is that it's the most biologically diverse ecosystems that are the most resilient in harsh conditions. The bulwark against invasion of exotic species. And again, in many cases, our higher elevation, our wilderness areas, our roadless areas are the areas that are today most biologically diverse. In fact, according to Nature Conservancy's survey, 181 of the 327 watersheds identified as critical to conserve biodiversity in the United States are on National Forest System lands. But you know, that isn't always the way it was, because the fact is that the areas that were historically most biologically diverse are your bottomlands, your riparian areas, and are primarily in private ownership today. So we're looking at this remnant of high elevation, undisturbed areas, really thinking that, gee, you know, these are really biologically diverse. Well, the fact is that's what's left in many areas, and we need to somehow reverse that trend. Leopold's famous quote, "To keep every cog in the wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering." Leopold spoke with great sadness when he spoke about one of the missing cogs in the wheel, when he was talking to the planners of the passenger pigeon monument. And this is what he said: "There will always be pigeons in books and in museums. These are effigies and images, dead to all hardships and dead to all delights. Book pigeons cannot dive out of the cloud to make a deer run for cover, nor clap their wings in thunderous applause of mass-laden woods. They know no urge of seasons, they feel no kiss of sun, no lash of wind and weather. They live by not living at all." That says it all. when it comes to species extinction. Off-road vehicles and that challenge, I believe, will be, at least for the public lands, probably the issue of the decade. And it's going to be a challenging issue to deal with, a controversial issue. And my hope is that we get on with it, because the longer we wait, the more challenging it will be. And I hope that we've learned from issues like the spotted owl that we shouldn't leave things to the court system to decide, that we should roll up our sleeves and dive in there and realize that it's going to be controversial, but it's something we need to deal with. For example, in my home state, we've got 2 national forests, 1.5 million acres, the Chequamegon and Nicolet. The Chequamegon is open unless marked closed. The Nicolet is closed unless marked open. Now, Roger, how'd you like to deal with the controversies associated with that when people really don't know what national forest they're on? Challenges we need to come to grips with that won't get any easier. I want to mention private land conservation only because that's really where the great strides in watershed restoration are to be made, because it's really all connected. And the fact is, in the United States, we've got 9.9 million woodland owners, and only 5% have professionally developed science-based management plans for whatever purpose or goal they have. And this is not a big brother coming in and telling you what to do with your land. This is somebody coming in with the best science, a professional, and your objective might be to grow sugar maple and make maple syrup. It might be a small game bird habitat. It might be short rotation species of aspen. It might be almost anything. And the fact is, there's a crying need on private lands for better professionally based management that will increase profit margins of landowners significantly. And in most cases, the service is free. We've got a long way to go in private land conservation. We've come a long way, and I can't talk about private land conservation without at least mentioning urban forests. 60 million acres of urban forest in the United States. In the city of Atlanta, if you plant 3 trees of the right species in the right location around a single family home, over an entire community, you reduce your air conditioning cost by 40% and significantly reduce stormwater runoff costs. Not only do you improve the aesthetic qualities and the beauty of the city, you do a lot for energy conservation, you do a lot for clean water and stormwater runoff. It's so important. In fact, as I watch foresters grapple with the challenges they've had as we move through to cut trees, not to cut trees, the clear cut debates, and all of these kinds of things. And yet here we deal with this tremendous opportunity of 60 million acres of urban forest, and you know, people love trees. Tremendous benefits to cities and towns. And the last one I want to mention is, and this is my number 10 of the 10 biggies, is education. And I mention it last, perhaps because I believe it's ultimately perhaps the most important. What we need is an informed debate. We need people that respect the land, that feel connected to nature, and we're dealing with a populace where 80% of the American public lives in urban areas and large cities and towns, with fewer and fewer people growing up further disconnected from the land. Milk comes from the jug, water comes from the tap or the bottle in the machine in the store. The fact is that's really not the way it is. And I mentioned Alda Leopold as one of my heroes, and I was at the Leopold conference a couple of years ago in Madison. It was the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Sand County Almanac, and I was on a panel with Nina Leopold Bradley. And the entire Leopold family are just very, very humble, wonderful people. And someone asked her the question about, well, what was it like to be with Dad at the shack as a little girl? And her answer was very crisp and simple, and that's where we learned to connect with nature. And the fact is, our public lands as more and more private lands become inaccessible that are posted. You've got to belong to a hunting club, a fishing club. You've got to own a lease, or perhaps it's just off limits. We're putting more and more people on the remaining acres of public land that we have, and this is where this urban population, the people that recreate, that learn how to connect with the land, that's so important. And perhaps a second very, very important value for public lands beyond water will likely be education in this century. One of the few remaining places that people can go. And I mean, I'm not that old. You know, I may be retired from the Forest Service, but I'm not as old as Bill Wharf. And where I grew up, almost all the private land is posted. I moved to Virginia, where I lived for almost 15 years. I want to go hunting, I belong to a hunting club. Had a pretty good deal, but a lot of people can't afford to belong to a hunting club. It's just too much hassle. And this is why public lands connected to education is so important. And we've got to connect people to the land. Because education, as I think about the theme of your rendezvous, is about making connections. It's about making connections in people's minds, about making connections in people's hearts, helping them understand why protecting the core is important, helping them understand why the core is important and what the core is. And that core is our old-growth forests, our wildlands, the source of our clean water, habitats for our species to persist. It's about the quality of life. Thank you, and have a wonderful rendezvous.